So it's going to be very hot out. As you can see, we have air conditioning in here. We have extra water. We have ice by the water. We try to stay cool. And yeah, but in the meantime, you have this sweet scarf. And I rather like the scarves. I think they not only will keep you warm, but are also good if you're in the mood for having an adventure, which I believe we all are. If you didn't want adventures, you shouldn't have come to Portland. Because Portland is weird. People know the slogan, keep Portland weird, but they don't usually stop to think about how weird Portland actually is. And it has some very weird people and creatures in it. And that influence stretches far beyond the city borders, as far as to the beach, Cannon Beach in particular. If you were coming up Highway 101 to this event, you would have stopped through Cannon Beach, and you might have run into our first speaker. Known by teenagers and patrolmen alike, our first speaker has an unusual appearance, let's say, always described as being a man wrapped in bloody bandages, known by the scent of rotting flesh. The Bandage Man, as he is known, is often seen in the backs of cars and has been reportedly responsible for multiple murders. Not the type of person you would like to meet out on the road. The Bandage Man, we like to call Kris Buytaert.
Good morning. Okay, so that's what I get for getting a grumpy face and being Belgian. So good morning again. Whoa, echo. Is the echo off? Okay, it's better, thanks. So I come all the way from Belgium. I'm talking about 7.5 years of DevOps. And I know a lot of you don't know me because I'm one of the quiet guys. But if you look at what I've been doing for the past 20 years, I started out as a developer. And a lot of you probably started out similarly. Then I became an operations guy. These days, my job is I'm the CTO, which stands for Chief Travel Agent, and not technical stuff, at Inuit, and we're a local European consultancy company. And I help people deploy software. I've been doing that for 10 to 15 years, using open source tools. I'm known on Twitter because people shout at me when they find DNS problems. And what I do is I evangelize DevOps, and I've been doing that for ages in my role as organizer of DevOps Days, which I started out with Patrick 7.5 years ago. Next to that, I do config management, Camp Low Days, and a couple of other things, but enough about me. I can hear where James is sitting already. So today I'm going to talk to you about the story of DevOps Days, how we got there, what we learned, and where we're going. Who knows where this is? I'm going to ignore the 5 people who've seen this slide before. Ken knows, Jason knows, Toshan knows. Anybody got a clue? Which continent? Europe. Which country? Belgium. Getting close. Which city? Ah, come on. It's not Ghent, it's not Brussels. It's Antwerp. This is where, for me, the DevOps journey started. It was where I was talking to Patrick Dubois, at a cloud camp Antwerp 6 months before we started the first DevOps Days, and where we got the idea that we met a lot of people along our journeys, along our travels, talking at conferences on how to deploy software, how to do a large scale infrastructure. And we figured out, well, there's basically no conference where developers and operations people meet. At least not in Europe. Over here, you guys had Velocity, but we didn't have anything. We had operations conferences, we had development conferences, and we saw some people who went to both, but there was no event where we actually shared our experiences and started talking to each other. So we got the idea to start something. Like a really small thing, nothing professional. And Patrick was working for the Belgian Research Institute for Broadband at that time. They had a nice venue where we could host something. I said, let's get some friends involved, let's get some sponsoring, and we started. We didn't even have a name. That name came a couple of months later when John Aspal and Paul Hammond were doing their talk at Velocity, 10 deploys a day, Dev and Ops working together, and Patrick had the idea, hey, what about we call it DevOps Days? A couple of other people chimed in and had their influence, and somewhere late that year, we had our first event. Small one. If you go to DevOpsDays.org archive site, you'll still find these people. That's the list of people who were there. Not a couple of hundred, not 1,200 like we had in Beijing in March, but small group of people. You could say Patrick and mine best friends. Like, if you look at those people, we pretty much knew them all. And if you looked at the topics, and the people's background, it was a mixture of people doing open source, people who had been doing open source for 5, 10, 15 years, senior open source people we knew how agile worked, who had been influenced by the agile movement, who were doing software delivery in an agile fashion, and people who were adopting the cloud, whether it was private cloud, whether it was public cloud, we were discussing all kinds of tooling. And that group of people together was the group of people who first started DevOps Days. The success of the event was basically the format. We had, just like you're going to experience here today, in the morning we had a bunch of formal talks. We had people talking about agile, we had people talking about Kanban, we had people talking about tools. Theo Tyree was there from Puppet. We had people talking about OpenQRM, stuff like that. And in the afternoon, we had open spaces. And we had people discussing and exchanging their experience with their peers, with practitioners, with people who actually solved similar problems before. We talked about both their success and their failure, not a vendor talking about the happy news story. We had people talking about real experiences. And that was it. It was fun. We had people coming from all over the place. We had Lindsay Holmwood coming from Australia talking about Flapjack. We had John Willis, who basically was in Atlanta the evening before, tweeting from some conference, and we were like, oh, John said he was going to come, but he's not going to fly over. He's still in Atlanta, and it's 10 o'clock in the evening. And that very Friday morning, he was actually in Gent before I did. I was like, oh, John, you're here. And he was actually the person who took the idea and the concept back to this continent. So him and Damon Edwards, somewhere half a year later, started doing exactly the same we did, but in Mountain View. We had one in Sydney. We had one in Sao Paulo. And the first couple of years, we were like, there's one big event in Europe, there's one big event in the States, and maybe some smaller ones around it. So we did Hamburg, we did Göteborg. In Rome, we figured out it's all about culture. And then in 2013, things started really happening. London ran twice. There was Paris for the first time. There was Amsterdam for the first time. And if I'm not losing count, Berlin also happened for the first time. Because I think they also are celebrating their 5th anniversary already. And we didn't plan that. We had absolutely no idea how to run those things back then. And we just saw people take on the format and copy it and do exactly the same which we did. And then people started asking, so what is this DevOps things about? How do you get there? What do you do? And we started having people trying to get a definition. They call it camps. John and Damon did a podcast. We came up with the keyword. And a lot of people quickly said, oh, it's a scam. So we added the L. And we started having more discussions. Because at DevOps Days Gent and later in Hamburg, we decided to not have a manifesto. Because we had seen what happened with the Agile Manifesto. For a lot of people, those became empty, hollow words, and we didn't want to have that. So people started calling it a professional and cultural movement. Adam Jacob did there. And in a lot of the discussions we had on should we have a manifesto, should we have a definition, we also came up with the discussion like, but what do we call people who do this? And Andrew Roy Schaefer said, well, we call them good at their job. We don't call them a DevOps engineer. And more people started saying, hey, you're not doing it right. You're doing something wrong. You missed out on the security people. You missed out on the DBAs. And you know, there's three hard things in IT, right? There's naming things, off by one errors, and we didn't miss out on them. We included them up front. If we looked at the first DevOps days, pretty much all the people were there. There was QA people, there were DBAs in there. But they didn't fit into the name. We couldn't call it startups. And the S in there stands for security, right? And we said, lots of people said, but the things you're talking about, you cannot do that in the enterprise. This will only work in startups. And it's only going to work in California. And we're like, look, this thing has started by a bunch of people in Brussels, Gent, Antwerp, in Belgium, who worked in enterprises. I was working for a telecom manufacturer. Patrick's last project was actually in a government agency. So it's not about the enterprise. It's not about the startups. Enterprise DevOps is not different from what we're talking about. DevOps did not start in the startup ecosystem. It started out in completely different parts. And it grew. More events came. And we started seeing some things happening. A lot of the talks was about culture, but there were new topics popping up. Who remembers that slide? Back in Rome, Ulf Manson from, I think he was still at Volvo then, or might have moved on then, gave a talk about his newfound love in monitoring. After John Vincent started tweeting about monitoring sucks, Ulf came up with, I started automating things. I learned how to manage my monitoring stack. And I've got a newfound love for monitoring. And his kids were drawing his slides, and it was awesome. And a new conference started. Monitorama started. In Europe, we have OSMC. Because for some reason, Monitorama only went to Berlin once and never gets back, sadly. So we have to come over here. I started Configuration Management Camp because we had Puppet Camp, which was growing, but we also saw the other tools popping up, and we wanted to have collaboration between those tools. We wanted to have people exchange what they'll learn and not reinvent the wheel all over again. So we had a couple of sub-movements. DevOps Days stayed focused on culture, but the other events started focusing on tooling and other topics. So it was all fun. Till the marketeers kicked in. They started doing stuff like DevOps engineers and DevOps certified products and DevOps certification and putting a stamp, this is a DevOps tool on your product, because they didn't get it. They didn't get the fact that a DevOps engineer is not somebody who does development and operations together. They didn't get the fact that if you put a DevOps team in between your operations team and your development team, you actually created a new silo. And they didn't realize that if they take their old legacy software and just put a DevOps hashtag on it, they haven't solved anything. Because it's hard for them. It's still really hard to sell DevOps. I think Ken is going to do an Ignite about it later today. But selling DevOps it's selling culture. It's figuring out how to work together. It's figuring out how to be a better person. And it's not something you can get from subscription, which you renew every couple of years. So vendors getting involved is really hard. Vendors getting involved into DevOps Days, as DevOps Days organizers will see, is also very hard, because a lot of them don't understand how to do it. A lot of them do. They realize that their place is inside the open spaces, discussing with the people, sharing their knowledge, exchanging their experience, rather than sitting, hiding behind a booth, trying to get a lead. So it's hard. There also was fun. For some reason, we managed to 5 years of DevOps Days, and we celebrated in Gent. And we gave everybody a certificate there. Funny part is, Bernd, who's hiding somewhere in the audience, beat us with that ID when he did it in Berlin the month before. Because we were happy that we were come to that place where we had a large enough audience that would understand that certification was irrelevant. Because we cannot certify people for being a good person, for being a good colleague, working together. So we just gave out free certifications. We learned a lot. We learned that in DevOps Days, if you look at for example, Amsterdam or Berlin, who have been going for 5 years, you see new audiences pop up. For who this is the first DevOps days. That's a lot. We still need to talk about what DevOps is really about. We still need to lay down the basics. Because for a lot of new people, they haven't heard the stories. They haven't experienced what we've been experiencing. We also saw that the old schoolers, they come for the hallway track, or they just skip out, because there's no real incentives for them. The first couple of years, when I went to a DevOps Days, I knew that I was going to come back with 5 to 10 new ideas to try out, maybe a couple of tools, maybe a couple of other things. But these days, the incentive for me to learn is getting lower and lower. So I'm getting enthusiastic by actually sharing my knowledge and spreading it. But I still stay hungry for new topics. Those topics have evolved. 5, 6 years ago, when we were talking about culture, we were actually explaining people the differences between Kanban and Scrum, discussing what Lean was about, discussing what Agile was and what fake Agile was, looking at how some people think that the Agile movement had failed. A lot of the examples of the people who were coming to our events and talking about their experiences were from startups. That's been evolving. Now we get banks, we get large manufacturers, we get retailers to talk. We had unicorns back then. And we had like the good examples, the poster childs. And these days, like, everybody's there. Everybody is talking about how to engage management, how to fight burnout. It's completely new topics from 5 years ago. On a technology point of view, there's also a lot that changed. Or maybe not. 10 years ago, we were talking about infrastructure as code popping up. We were talking about tools like Chef, CF Engine, Puppet. And these days, apparently, people talk about, let's do this again in Bash, and translate that to YAML. We were talking about orchestration tools, about continuous integration, continuous delivery. New tools popped up. Back in the days, we were talking about how to build our own clusters. We had a bunch of alternatives out there. We had OpenStack, CloudStack, Eucalyptus, OpenNebula, OpenQRM, and a bunch of others, and now there's only one survived. A bunch of other topics. We had a variety of virtualization tools. Today we have Docker, 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 Docker. I'm not sure if we improved there. We learned about building and sharing our development space with developers and giving them a platform that was actually relevant and representable for what we were doing in production. And these days we give them Docker. We had discussions on how do you scale platforms? How do you make them high availability? How do you get traffic to your action? How do you make sure that your data is redundant? We're still having those discussions. We still haven't solved these. We still need to talk to people if you want to go to the cloud, if you want to do distributed computing, if you want to do containers. You need to solve these problems. We still haven't. Back then we were talking about DRBD and SEP and Gluster to solve our storage needs. And these days the go-to solution is back to NFS. Because that's the thing which integrates with most containers, and we've stepped back 15 years. Testing hasn't really improved. We still need to write tests in a really awkward way. We started discussing test-driven development. We started discussing a bunch of topics. But testing is still something that a lot of people ignore. I cannot count the number of pipelines over the 5 years that I built together with customers which still have dummy tests in there. A couple of things improved. We figured out that Git is probably the way forward. There's not too many discussion going on about using Git. 5, 10 years ago, we still needed to instruct system administrators and developers to use version control. These days, that's there. And release management, a lot of people are still struggling with that. I've solved it by using Git, but not everybody does that. On the monitoring part, a lot of things have evolved, luckily. We went from Nagios to Ikenga, at least in Europe we did. We went from a lot of tools to building new open source tools, to using new open source tools. And a lot of us went from monitoring SOX to monitoring Love, because we now had a stack which was manageable, which was scalable, which was under control, and which wasn't bloated. It worked. But the biggest part we learned is that whether we choose Docker or whether we choose full VMs, whether we use Puppet or Chef, or whether we use Nagios or Ikinga, the tools are not going to help us. The tools are only a part of the solution. It really is about the culture. And the tooling hype we get about a bunch of those tools is not really moving us forward. What we did learn is that we need to get back to the roots. We need to get working together to figure out how to collaborate for a better platform. A lot of us are grasping back to open source tools because we have known and we have understood that they work. We talk about common sense, we talk about empathy, and we realize that DevOps is still a people problem and not a technology problem. And that's a message we need to keep sharing. DevOps Days has evolved. I constantly need to update that slide, but there were more than 175 events over the past couple of years. If we look in the Slack channel, where all of the organizers sit, there's more than 450 people organizing a DevOps Days in a local city. Who's organizing a DevOps Days here? In his local city. That's not too much. Could be better. We have a core team of DevOps Days organizers who actually help people to kickstart an event. For some weird reason, there's only 2 European ones in here and a non-American one, but Bernd is actually, together with me, one of the core DevOps Days organizers these days. And what we do is we help people to set up new events. We typically advise people to start with a local meetup, get that going, and then reach out to the core organization. I mean, there's a bunch of people in the States helping you there. You don't have to talk to different time zones. Build a team, start running it. That's how you start DevOps Days. I'm pretty sure, like every DevOps Days, we'll have an open space discussing how to do that. So that's what DevOps Days is coming from. That's where we're going. If after these 2 days, 3 days, because we're adding 2 extra days, you're interested in sharing your experiences, you're interested in talking about what you have learned, there are still a number of cities which allow you to do some nice travel also, who have open call for papers where you can submit your ID. And then you might actually be going to Warsaw or Ohio or Tel Aviv to talk about your experiences. So with that said, I want you all to enjoy DevOps Days Portland. I know I will. And enjoy the rest of the week.
Thank you so much, Bandage Man. We actually have a few minutes before our sponsor pitches. I don't think that they are all in here just yet. So if anyone has any questions for Kris, now is the time. And if you could repeat the question back into your microphone. Does anyone have any questions for Kris? No? Over there, yes.
Question.
What's the most rewarding thing so far for you?
So the question is, what's the most rewarding thing so far? I think the most rewarding thing so far is actually helping an organization go through a transition and seeing a grumpy old Unix graybeard go from, no, I only want to do things my way, to actually being a Scrum Master, taking a team, and taking his infrastructure team to do continuous delivery on his infrastructure. If I started talking to that person the first time, I was like, oh man, this guy is going to be hard to convince. His boss wants him to change, but he's probably looking at retirement rather than whatever. And by talking to him, by exchanging both of our experiences, he was like, maybe this is a good thing to do. And you saw him really evolve into a new person. And for me, that was one of the most rewarding things. And I think a lot of other people have seen similar people change from, what am I doing here? It's a 9-to-5 job, to having fun again in what they're doing on a daily basis. For me, that was really rewarding. That and seeing part of the world. Over there.
Do you think
because large organizations typically are comfortable with the idea of purchasing tools and organizing people in certain ways, that in certain cases, DevOps teams and more of a focus on tools can be a good way to Trojan horse some of this stuff into larger enterprises?
That's a very long question to repeat. So the question is that if I think of it in some ways, larger organizations would have been working the way they do, if introducing tools could help. Is that a good summary?
Pretty much.
Trojan horsing a tool in there. I think you can, and in a lot of cases, you need to. But if they keep buying stuff and keep adopting a change as a project, you need to convince them that there's other ways out there, and you need to show them how other people have been doing it before. Sometimes introducing a tool could help people to give them a completely different mindset. One of the things I did with a large bank in Europe was basically tell them to drop their full stack, which they currently had, and start building everything on a new stack. And for that, every single team member needed to start thinking in a different way than he was doing before, because he couldn't grab back to what he's been doing for the past 5 years. For the whole team, everything was new. And I was introducing a new tool, I was introducing a new ecosystem, and that introduced the change, because they had to rethink everything. They couldn't fall back on what they knew. It could work, it could fail. I think there's also the thing that you cannot go into organizations and say, if you do these, and these steps, it's going to work. Every organization has different backgrounds, has different needs, has different problems. And you need to be adaptive to those. You need to realize that it's going to be a journey, and the journey is going to be different for everybody. And that journey is part of what they need to understand. They need to go through that. Other questions? In the middle.
How have you solved release management using Git?
A lot of people call me crazy.
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, sorry. How have I solved release management doing Git? So a lot of people call me crazy, but we have one master Git project, and we have Git hashes who point to submodules, and that's how we map releases together. So the main project is the project which actually ties together all the links to all the products which work together. And it's basically Git hashes. And that works for a lot of the projects we have. People have been doing stuff like Librarian, which hides the complexity, but it's basically Git hashes and reference to those. And I've got projects which work both Java, PHP, some Python projects, and Puppet code bases who actually do release management that way. But it's awkward for some people. It's not the most trivial one, because a lot of people still want a UI on top of it. Any other questions?
We can do like 3 more minutes of questions. You spoke very fast, so.
I spoke very fast, and that's for a foreigner.
And now we need to absorb your wisdom.
I'm here for 3 more days to absorb my wisdom.
If anyone would like to drain Kris immediately of his wisdom, now is the time.
I think basically the real trick is you get to live in a country which has a similar weather climate like this one, but you add really good quality beer. I figured out you guys are trying to do that. You add really good quality chocolate. Still need to figure that out in the US.
There are some places in Portland, but
there
yeah.
are some places, yeah, but... And that's how you start. I mean, good beer, good food.
Awesome.
You've been to Belgium way too much, James.
Awesome. Another round of applause for Kris, please.